Hey guys, welcome back to another Atlas Archives journey, where tonight we're venturing into Honduras, a country that somehow managed to become the world's original banana republic without actually being shaped like a banana. Nestled in the heart of Central America, Honduras is the only country in the region that looked at volcanoes and said, "No thank you," making it refreshingly explosion-free. Though as we'll discover, it's had plenty of other types of eruptions throughout its history. From the magnificent Maya ruins of Copán to the dual coastlines that give Honduras a foot in both the Caribbean and Pacific worlds, this is a land where geography has played cosmic-level pranks on human ambition for over 5 centuries. We'll explore how mountains that cover 3/4 of the country created a natural fortress that couldn't quite keep out Spanish conquistadors, American fruit companies, or the occasional neighbour with strong opinions about soccer matches. If you're ready for stories that'll ease you into sleep while expanding your world, hit that subscribe button, because every country has secrets worth discovering, and we're just getting started. So dim those lights, settle into your favourite listening position, and let's journey together into the remarkable story of Honduras. Chapter 1. The Heart of Central America. Picture, if you will, a triangular slice of paradise wedged perfectly between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Honduras is that rare treasure, a nation blessed with not one, but 2 coastlines, like having both chocolate and vanilla ice cream in your bowl. Though to be fair, if we're talking ice cream analogies, Honduras is more like that fancy gelato that has layers of complexity you didn't expect when you ordered it. Our story begins not with conquistadors or ancient kings, but with the raw, magnificent bones of the earth itself. Honduras sits like a geological masterpiece on display, covering approximately 43,000 square miles, making it the second largest country in Central America, just behind Nicaragua. Think of it as the middle child of Central America, not the biggest like Nicaragua, not the smallest like Belize, but somehow managing to capture everyone's attention anyway, probably by doing something completely unexpected like having 2 different oceans for neighbours. The name Honduras itself comes from the Spanish word for depths, supposedly coined by Christopher Columbus himself when he anchored in the deep waters off the coast in 1502, though one has to wonder if Columbus was being poetic about the ocean depths, or if he was just having one of those days where everything seemed unnecessarily complicated. "Depths," he muttered, probably while struggling with his anchor chain. Why is everything in this new world so deep and confusing? Geographically speaking, Honduras is positioned like nature's own geography textbook, bordered by Guatemala to the northwest, El Salvador to the southwest, and Nicaragua to the southeast. But the real magic happens where the land meets the sea. The northern Caribbean coastline stretches for an impressive 426 miles, while the southern Pacific coast along the Gulf of Fonseca extends for just 56 miles. It's as if Honduras decided to dip one foot enthusiastically into the Caribbean and just barely test the Pacific waters with its toes. The interior of Honduras is where Mother Nature apparently decided to show off. More than 3/4 of the country is mountainous, and we're not talking gentle rolling hills where you might have a pleasant Sunday stroll. These are serious mountains, with peaks reaching up to 9,420 feet above sea level at Cerro Las Minas. The mountainous terrain creates a landscape that looks like someone crumpled up a map and then said, "Perfect, let's put people here." What makes Honduras particularly special among its Central American neighbours is that it's the only country in the region without volcanoes. While Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua are busy dealing with their temperamental volcanic personalities, Honduras sits there calmly, like the friend in your group who never causes drama but somehow always ends up in the middle of everyone else's chaos anyway. These mountains aren't just pretty to look at, They're the backbone of Honduras, creating distinct regions that might as well be different countries. The western and central highlands are dominated by the volcanic highlands, even though they're not actually volcanic anymore. It's like having a retired athlete in your family who still insists on wearing their varsity jacket. Technically accurate, but the glory days are long past. The climate of Honduras varies dramatically with elevation, creating what geographers love to call vertical zonation, which is a fancy way of saying that if you don't like the weather, you can literally climb up or down a mountain to find something different. The lowland coastal areas maintain tropical temperatures year-round, averaging between 79 and 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, up in the mountain basins at 2,000 to 4,000 feet, temperatures drop to a more comfortable 66 to 73 degrees, perfect for those who want to experience the tropics without actually melting. The capital city of Tegucigalpa sits at 3,200 feet above sea level, perched in the mountains like a bird's nest built by particularly ambitious architects. During the rainy season from May through November, temperatures can reach 90 degrees in May before dropping to a crisp 50 degrees in December. It's like living in a place where Mother Nature can't make up her mind about the thermostat. Honduras experiences what locals call verano and invierno, the dry season and wet season respectively. But don't let the Spanish fool you. Invierno doesn't mean winter in the traditional sense. It just means the time when the sky remembers it has a job to do and starts raining. The Caribbean coast receives rain practically year-round, with annual precipitation ranging from 70 to 110 inches. The Pacific side, meanwhile, gets 60 to 80 inches annually, but takes a complete vacation from rain between December and April, as if the clouds have union contracts. The river systems of Honduras tell their own geographic story. The mighty Ulua River flows 400 kilometers to the Caribbean through the economically important Valle de Sula. Think of it as Honduras's main highway, if highways were made of water and occasionally flooded. The Ulua has been carrying sediment and stories from the interior highlands to the coast for millennia, creating the fertile valleys that would later become the backbone of Honduras's economy. On the Caribbean side, the longest river in Central America, the Rio Coco, forms much of the border with Nicaragua. At 680 kilometers long, it's like a natural fence that occasionally floods your backyard. Other significant Caribbean draining rivers include the Patuca, Aguan, and Camilecon, names that sound like they could be either ancient Mayan gods or the starting lineup for a very exotic baseball team. The Pacific drainage tells a different story entirely. These rivers are shorter and steeper, reflecting the proximity of the continental divide to the Pacific coast. The Choluteca and Nacaome rivers rush down from the mountains to the Gulf of Fonseca like water sliding down a playground slide, enthusiastic, quick, and occasionally out of control. Lake Yojoa stands as Honduras's only natural lake, stretching 22 kilometers long and 14 kilometers wide at its broadest point. It sits in the west-central part of the country like a blue jewel in a green setting, providing fresh water and serving as home to more than 400 species of birds. Unfortunately, like many beautiful things, Lake Yojoa has faced challenges from deforestation and pollution, a reminder that even in paradise, humans have a talent for complicating things. The Caribbean coastal lowlands, known locally as the North Coast, or simply the coast, have traditionally been Honduras's most exploited region economically. The central part of these lowlands, east of La Ceiba, is just a few kilometers wide, like nature's version of a tightrope. But to the east and west, the lowlands widen into broad river valleys, creating pockets of incredibly fertile land that seem almost too good to be true. The broadest of these valleys follows the Rio Ulua near the Guatemalan border and represents Honduras's most developed agricultural area. It's here that much of the country's banana cultivation took place, earning Honduras its somewhat dubious distinction as the original Banana Republic, though that's a story for later sections. Eastern Honduras features La Mosquitia, a vast lowland jungle that remains largely undeveloped. This region is like Honduras's wild backyard, the place where nature still calls the shots and humans are merely polite visitors. La Mosquitia encompasses about 1/5 of the total land area and is densely forested in the interior highlands, making it a haven for wildlife and a challenge for anyone trying to build roads. The Pacific lowlands, centered on the Gulf of Fonseca, represent the smallest geographic region of Honduras. This narrow strip of land, averaging 25 kilometers wide, is characterized by flat terrain that becomes swampy near the Gulf shores. The soil here is composed mostly of alluvial deposits washed down from the mountains. Essentially, it's mountain dirt that decided to take a vacation at the beach. Several islands in the Gulf of Fonseca fall under Honduran jurisdiction, including Zacate Grande and El Tigre. These islands are eroded volcanoes from the chain that extends along the Pacific coast of Central America, serving as landmarks for vessels entering Honduras's Pacific waters. They rise from the sea like ancient guardians, watching over the narrow Pacific coastline with volcanic dignity. Off the northern Caribbean coast lie the Bay Islands, Islas de la Bahia, a stunning archipelago that includes Roatan, Utila, and Guanaja. These islands sit 50 to 60 kilometers offshore like scattered emeralds in an azure setting. They're surrounded by part of the Mesoamerican reef system, the second largest coral reef system in the world. Think of it as Honduras's underwater museum, complete with colourful fish exhibits and coral sculptures that would make any artist jealous. The geological foundation of Honduras reflects its position at the complex junction of the North American, Caribbean, and Cocos tectonic plates. This tectonic complexity has created a landscape characterized by seismic activity and a diverse array of mineral deposits. The country sits on geological layers that read like a history book: Paleozoic metamorphic rocks, Mesozoic sedimentary formations, and Cenozoic volcanic deposits, all stacked together like geological pancakes. Natural resources in Honduras include timber, gold, silver, copper, lead, zinc, iron ore, antimony, coal, fish, shrimp, and hydropower potential from those mountain rivers we mentioned earlier. It's like nature created Honduras as a one-stop shopping center for natural resources, then forgot to include the instruction manual for sustainable extraction. The climate patterns of Honduras are significantly influenced by El Niño and La Niña events. During El Niño years, rainfall decreases and temperatures increase, while La Niña brings the opposite effects. It's as if the Pacific Ocean has mood swings that directly affect Honduras's weather, like having a neighbor whose emotions control your air conditioning. The trade winds blow consistently from the east and northeast toward the west, providing a moderating influence on temperatures and bringing moisture from the Caribbean. These winds have been so reliable that sailors have depended on them for centuries. They're like the postal service of the atmosphere, delivering weather with impressive consistency. However, the Caribbean hurricane season from June to November occasionally interrupts this pleasant routine. While the Bay Islands and Caribbean coast of Honduras are generally outside the typical hurricane path, they do receive the effects of tropical storms. Hurricane Mitch in 1998 proved that sometimes nature decides to make exceptions to its own rules, devastating Honduras, and serving as a reminder that geography is not just about pretty landscapes, it can also be about survival. This geographic foundation has shaped every aspect of Honduran life, from the ancient Maya who first recognized the fertility of these river valleys, to modern-day farmers who still work the same alluvial soils. The mountains that divide the country have also divided its development, creating distinct regions with their own cultures, economies, and challenges. The dual coastlines have given Honduras access to both Atlantic and Pacific trade routes, while also making it vulnerable to storms from both sides. As we settle into our exploration of Honduras, remember that this landscape we've described isn't just a backdrop for human history, it's been an active participant. Every river, mountain, and coastal plain has influenced the course of events, from determining where ancient civilizations flourished, to shaping the routes of Spanish conquistadors, to influencing modern agricultural patterns. The geography of Honduras has created both opportunities and challenges, abundance and vulnerability. It's a land where you can experience tropical beaches and cool mountain valleys within a few hours' travel, where ancient rivers still carve their paths through modern landscapes, and where the very ground beneath your feet tells stories of geological drama spanning millions of years. So, as we prepare to dive into the human stories that have unfolded across this remarkable landscape, keep in mind the stage upon which they've played out. Honduras is not just a country, it's a geographic personality with its own moods, gifts, and challenges, all of which have profoundly shaped the extraordinary tale we're about to tell. Chapter 2: Ancient Kingdoms and the Maya Marvel. In the misty valleys and along the fertile river banks of ancient Honduras, long before any European had ever dreamed of such a place, sophisticated civilizations were already writing their stories in stone and clay. Tonight, we journey back through the mists of time to discover the indigenous peoples who first called this remarkable landscape home and witness the rise of one of the most spectacular Maya cities ever built, a place called Copán. The story of human settlement in Honduras stretches back thousands of years, like chapters in a very old book that archaeologists are still learning to read. The first peoples to settle permanently in what would become Honduras arrived around 1500 BCE, probably carrying with them stories, traditions, and agricultural knowledge from their migrations through Central and North America. They looked at these river valleys and mountain slopes and said, "Yes, this is where we'll make our home," though we assume they said it in languages we can no longer speak. By the time of European contact, Honduras was home to a fascinating mosaic of indigenous peoples, each group as distinct from the others as different flavors in a very complex cultural stew. The largest and most influential of these groups were the Lenca, who controlled much of the central and western highlands. If the Maya were the intellectuals of ancient Mesoamerica, the Lenca were perhaps the pragmatists, skilled farmers, potters, and traders who built substantial settlements and developed complex social structures without feeling the need to carve dates into every available stone surface. The Lenca, with a population that may have exceeded 450,000 at their peak, were organized into numerous small kingdoms scattered throughout the mountainous interior. They built their towns on defensible positions, hilltops and ridges where they could see enemies coming from a comfortable distance. Their settlements averaged about 350 houses, which suggests communities of substantial size for the pre-Columbian period. These weren't tiny villages. These were proper towns where you'd actually need to ask for directions. Archaeological evidence suggests the Lenca were master potters and weavers, creating ceramics and textiles with geometric patterns that were both beautiful and distinctly their own. They developed intensive agricultural techniques, growing maize, beans, squash, and cacao in the fertile valleys. The fact that they cultivated cacao tells us something important about their trade connections. Cacao was valuable enough to be used as currency throughout Mesoamerica, like ancient chocolate money. Imagine if your salary was paid in candy bars. Actually, on second thought, don't imagine that too vividly, or you might never be satisfied with regular money again. In the eastern regions of Honduras, particularly in what locals call La Mosquitia, lived the Pech, also known as the Paya. The Pech were the people of the rivers, and they understood the rhythms of the rainforest in ways that would make modern environmentalists weep with admiration. They lived along the banks of rivers like the Patuca, developing a culture intimately connected to the water cycles and forest ecosystems of their homeland. The Pech were master fishermen and hunters, but they also practiced sophisticated forms of shifting agriculture that worked with, rather than against, the forest's natural patterns. They would clear small plots, grow crops for a few years, then move on, allowing the forest to reclaim the land while they cleared new areas. It was sustainable agriculture, practiced centuries before anyone invented the term sustainability, though they probably would have been puzzled by our need to create a special word for what seemed like simple common sense. Further north, in the mountainous regions, lived the Tolupan, sometimes called the Jichak, who were known for their fierce independence and their ability to remain largely autonomous, even as larger empires rose and fell around them. The Tolupan developed a culture that was distinctly their own, with traditions that emphasized their connection to the mountain landscapes they inhabited. They were like the mountain hermits of ancient Honduras, except instead of being antisocial, they were protecting a way of life they'd perfected over generations. Along the Caribbean coast and in the northeastern regions lived the Miskito, whose culture was shaped by both inland agriculture and coastal fishing. The Miskito were skilled navigators who could read wind patterns and ocean currents like other people read newspapers. They developed sophisticated fishing techniques and built trade networks that connected the Caribbean coast with inland communities. Their name would eventually be given to the entire eastern region of Honduras, La Mosquitia, though whether this honoured their prominence or just reflected Spanish confusion about who was who is lost to history. These diverse indigenous groups shared the territory of Honduras for centuries, sometimes trading peacefully, sometimes fighting, always adapting to the challenging geography of their shared homeland. They developed trade networks that connected communities across vast distances, carrying obsidian from Guatemala, jade from the Maya lands, and cacao from their own valleys to markets throughout Central America. It was like Amazon, but with llamas instead of delivery trucks, and you had to walk everywhere. But the most spectacular indigenous achievement in Honduras was still to come, and it would be built not by any of these local groups, but by migrants from the Maya heartland to the northwest. Around the 5th century CE, Maya civilization reached the fertile valley of the Copán River, drawn perhaps by the valley's agricultural potential, its position on important trade routes, or simply by reports that it was a lovely place to build a city. The Maya had been developing their remarkable civilization for centuries in the Petén region of Guatemala and the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. They were the ancient world's overachievers, developing sophisticated writing systems, mathematical concepts including the zero, astronomically accurate calendars, and architectural techniques that produced some of the most beautiful buildings in the ancient Americas. When the Maya decided to establish a major city in Honduras, they weren't just expanding their territory, they were bringing one of humanity's most advanced civilizations to a new frontier. The man who had established this Maya outpost in Honduras bore one of the most magnificent names in ancient American history. Kinich Yax Keuk Mo, which translates roughly as solar-faced first Quetzalcoatl, or sun-eyed green Quetzalcoatl. Try fitting that on a business card. This remarkable individual arrived in the Copán Valley in 426 CE, probably travelling from the great Maya city of Tikal in Guatemala, though some scholars argue he came from even farther north, perhaps from Teotihuacan in central Mexico. Kinich Yaxkeyuk Mo wasn't just a migrant looking for a nice place to retire. He was a warlord with a vision and the military capability to make it reality. Archaeological evidence suggests he came with followers, resources, and most importantly, the backing of one of the major Maya powers. When he established himself at Copán, he wasn't just founding a settlement, he was extending Maya civilization to its southeastern frontier, creating what would become one of the greatest Maya cities ever built. The choice of location for this new Maya city was brilliant. The Copán Valley sits at an elevation of about 600 meters in a fertile mountain valley that enjoys year-round water from the Copán River. The valley was large enough to support a substantial population, but defensible enough to protect it. The river provided not only water and transportation, but also connected the valley to larger trade networks that reached both the Caribbean and Pacific coasts. Kinich Yaks Keyuk Mo reigned for 11 years, from 426 to 437 CE, and in that relatively brief time, he laid the foundations for what would become a dynasty lasting 350 years. He established the basic layout of the city, began construction of the first major ceremonial buildings, and most importantly, created the political and religious institutions that would guide Copán's development for centuries to come. When the great king died in 437 CE, his son Popul Kinich took power and immediately set about honouring his father's memory in the most dramatic way possible by building a tomb that would become the foundation of all future construction in the city centre. This tomb, discovered by archaeologists and known as the Hunnel structure, contains what many believe are the remains of Kinich Yaks Keyuk Mo himself, along with burial goods that speak to his status and the wealth of his kingdom. Over the following centuries, each successive ruler built upon the foundations laid by the dynastic founder. Maya kings traditionally built new temples over old ones, creating layers of construction that preserved the old while celebrating the new. By the 8th century CE, Copán had become one of the greatest Maya cities, home to perhaps 20,000 people and renowned for its artistic achievements. The city's artisans created sculpture unmatched anywhere in the Maya world, but perhaps Copán's most spectacular achievement was its hieroglyphic stairway, completed around 753 CE. This stairway contains over 2,200 hieroglyphs, carved into its 63 steps, making it the longest Maya inscription ever discovered. Unfortunately, early archaeologists rearranged many blocks during restoration before Maya writing was understood, like reassembling a novel without knowing the language. The rulers commemorated on the hieroglyphic stairway weren't just names and dates. They were individuals with dramatic life stories. Take Uwaksaklahun Ubar Karwil, known as 18 Rabbit, who ruled from 695 to 738 CE. 18 Rabbit erected many of Copán's most beautiful stelae and oversaw remarkable artistic flowering. Unfortunately, in 738 CE, he was captured and beheaded by the ruler of Quirigua, a Maya city that had been Copán's vassal but decided to make a dramatic independent statement. It's the ancient Maya equivalent of a resignation letter that was perhaps slightly excessive. The death of 18 Rabbit marked the beginning of Copán's decline. His successor, Smoke Shell, completed the hieroglyphic stairway as both memorial and assertion that Copán remained powerful. The final ruler, Yaks Pasa, commissioned Altar Q in 775 CE, depicting all 16 rulers seated chronologically, with the founder symbolically passing authority to the final king. Altar Q was carved when Copán was already declining. By the late 8th century, the city faced environmental degradation, warfare, climate change, and internal instability. The Maya collapse at Copán was part of a broader phenomenon affecting cities throughout Central America during the 8th and 9th centuries CE, as populations fled and trade networks broke down. By 822 CE, Copán was abandoned as a major urban center, but indigenous Honduras didn't end with Maya collapse. The Lenca, Pech, Tolupan, Mosquito and other groups continued thriving, maintaining their traditions and creating a rich cultural landscape that would still be flourishing when the Spanish arrived. The legacy of Copán and the broader indigenous heritage represented remarkable achievements. The Maya had created a city rivaling anything in the contemporary world for sophistication and beauty, developing writing, mathematics, and astronomy that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. Indigenous peoples had developed sustainable living in challenging environments, creating societies that balanced human needs with ecological realities. When archaeologists first began studying Copán in the 19th century, they found a city that had been swallowed by the jungle but preserved by it as well. The same forest that had reclaimed the buildings had also protected them from the weather and from human destruction. The intricate carvings on temples and stelae emerged from their green shrouds as fresh and detailed as if they had been carved yesterday, carrying messages across more than 1,000 years, as clearly as if they had been posted in this morning's newspaper. The rediscovery of Copán in the modern era has revealed not just a lost city but an entire worldview, a sophisticated civilization that understood human relationships with nature, time, and the divine in ways profoundly different from European traditions. The Maya saw time as cyclical rather than linear, and the natural world as deserving respect rather than simple exploitation. Today, the descendants of these ancient peoples still live in Honduras, maintaining traditions that stretch back centuries. The Lenca, who form the largest indigenous group in modern Honduras with over 450,000 people, continue practicing traditional pottery making and weaving. The Miskito along the Caribbean coast maintain their connections to the sea and rivers their ancestors navigated for centuries. The story of ancient Honduras reminds us that long before European explorers discovered the Americas, these lands were home to civilizations with their own achievements to celebrate. The quiet plazas of Copán and the traditional villages of modern indigenous communities are connected by threads of memory and tradition that stretch across more than 1,500 years, carrying forward the wisdom of people who learned to call this remarkable landscape home. Chapter 3: The Conquistadors' Arrival and Colonial Transformation. The year 1502 marked one of those moments in history when two entirely different worlds collided, forever changing the destiny of Honduras and its people. On July 30th of that year, a weathered Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, stepped onto the shore of an island called Guanaja, in what we now know as the Bay Islands. He had no idea he was about to encounter one of the most complex and culturally rich regions of the Americas. Columbus was on his fourth and final voyage to what Europeans still called the Indies, though by this point even Columbus himself must have been having some doubts about whether he'd actually found a route to Asia. His previous 3 voyages had been varying degrees of successful disasters. He'd found new lands, certainly, but they kept being disappointingly short on the spices, silks, and easy wealth he'd promised his royal sponsors. This 4th voyage was his last chance to prove that he could deliver something more than just stories about naked people and strange plants. When Columbus arrived at Guanaja, he encountered something that should have given him pause: a massive canoe, described by his brother Bartholomew as long as a galley, filled with sophisticated trade goods and crewed by what were almost certainly Maya merchants. These weren't the simple island dwellers Columbus had encountered in the Caribbean. These were representatives of a complex commercial network that connected diverse civilizations across Central America. The canoe contained cacao beans, copper bells, textiles, obsidian blades, and other goods that spoke to advanced manufacturing and long-distance trade relationships. But Columbus, ever the optimist when it came to finding what he wanted to find, apparently convinced himself that the Maya merchant who spoke to him had described encountering people with horses and swords just 10 days away by the river Ganges. It's unclear whether Columbus actually believed he was near India, or whether he was just telling his sponsors what they wanted to hear. But either way, he was confident enough in his geographic assessment to name the deep waters off the coast Honduras, Spanish for depths, though it's quite possible he was referring to the depths of his own confusion, rather than the ocean floor. A few weeks later, on August 14th, Columbus became the first European to set foot on the Central American mainland near what is now Trujillo. The local inhabitants greeted him in what Spanish accounts describe as a friendly manner, which probably means they were polite enough not to point out immediately that these pale strangers clearly had no idea where they were or what they were doing. Columbus claimed the territory for the Spanish crown, performed the usual ceremonies, and then sailed eastward along the coast, fighting storms and difficult weather for weeks. What Columbus didn't realize, and what would become painfully clear to later Spanish explorers, was that he had stumbled upon a land that would be far more challenging to conquer and control than the Caribbean islands where Spain had already established its presence. Honduras was home to sophisticated indigenous civilizations with their own military traditions, complex societies, and absolutely no interest in being conquered by anyone, European or otherwise. After Columbus departed, Honduras enjoyed nearly 2 decades of relative peace from European interference. The Spanish were busy consolidating their control over the Caribbean islands and beginning their conquest of Mexico, but by the early 1520s, the success of Hernán Cortés in overthrowing the Aztec Empire had created a land rush of conquistadors looking for their own empires to conquer and their own fortunes to make. The Spanish conquest of Honduras, which began in earnest in 1523, turned into one of the most chaotic and poorly coordinated military operations in the history of European colonization. Instead of a single, unified expedition, Honduras was invaded simultaneously by multiple competing Spanish forces, each led by conquistadors who were more interested in claiming territory for themselves than in following any coherent plan. Gil González Dávila arrived from the Pacific side, having already conquered parts of Nicaragua and looking to expand his domain northward. Cristobal de Olid came from Cuba, sent by Cortés but with his own ambitious plans for independence. Francisco de las Casas was dispatched by Cortés to keep an eye on Olid, who Cortés suspected, correctly as it turned out, of planning to go rogue. Pedro de Alvarado advanced from Guatemala, and eventually Cortés himself decided he'd better show up personally to sort out the mess his subordinates had created. The result was a conquest that often looked more like a civil war among competing Spanish factions than a coordinated military operation. Olid did indeed attempt to establish his own independent authority, and was eventually executed by his own men, who had been convinced by Las Casas that loyalty to Cortés was a better career move. Meanwhile, the various Spanish expeditions spent almost as much energy fighting each other as they did fighting the indigenous inhabitants. The indigenous peoples of Honduras, watching these chaotic proceedings, initially tried a variety of responses. Some communities attempted diplomatic solutions, hoping to negotiate favourable terms with whichever Spanish faction seemed most likely to emerge victorious. Others chose immediate resistance, recognizing that these foreigners represented an existential threat to their way of life. Still others adopted a strategy of strategic withdrawal, abandoning their settlements and fleeing to more defensible positions in the mountains and forests. The Maya communities in the western regions, veterans of complex political and military conflicts, initially had some success using their established defensive tactics against the Spanish. The town of Ticamaya in the Ulua Valley had fortifications strong enough to frustrate several Spanish assaults. The defenders used techniques that had served them well against indigenous enemies, rolling boulders down mountainsides onto attacking forces, utilizing knowledge of local terrain and coordinating their resistance across multiple settlements. But the Spanish brought advantages that the Maya had never faced before: horses, steel weapons, firearms, and perhaps most devastatingly, diseases like smallpox, for which the indigenous populations had no immunity. Even more importantly, the Spanish proved willing to use tactics that violated every indigenous tradition of warfare, targeting non-combatants, destroying food supplies, and treating captured enemies as slaves rather than potential allies or exchange partners. The most famous indigenous resistance leader was a Lenca chief known as Lempira, whose name translates to Lord of the Mountains. Lempira recognized that the Spanish threat was unlike anything his people had faced before, and that only a coordinated, unified resistance could hope to succeed. He established his headquarters at a nearly impregnable fortress called Peñol de Cerquin, built atop a rocky butte that commanded the surrounding territory. Lempira's resistance was remarkable, not just for its military effectiveness, but for its political sophistication. He succeeded in uniting traditionally rival tribes under a common cause, creating an alliance that included not only Lenca communities but also Maya and other indigenous groups who recognized the existential threat posed by Spanish colonization. At its peak, Lempira's coalition may have included 30,000 warriors, a massive force by the standards of 16th century warfare. For months, Lempira's forces successfully defended their mountain strongholds against Spanish attacks. The Spanish found themselves unable to advance, unable to retreat safely, and running desperately short of supplies, as the indigenous alliance refused to provide them with food or safe passage. Spanish accounts describe the colonists as demoralized, fearing a massive Indian attack at any moment, and questioning the leadership of their commanders. The Spanish, faced with military failure, eventually resorted to treachery. In 1537 or 1538, they invited Lempira to peace negotiations, promising safe passage and honourable terms. When the great chief arrived to discuss terms, the Spanish murdered him during the supposed diplomatic meeting. It was an act of betrayal that violated every principle of indigenous warfare and diplomacy, but it effectively ended the unified resistance to Spanish conquest. With Lempira's death, the coordinated indigenous resistance collapsed. Individual communities continued to resist, and some remote areas remained effectively independent for years or even decades. But the dream of driving out the Spanish invaders died with the Lord of the Mountains. Today, Lempira's face appears on Honduran currency, and his name has been given to one of the country's departments, but during his lifetime he represented the last best hope for indigenous independence in Honduras. The defeat of Lempira's rebellion marked the beginning of effective Spanish control over most of Honduras. By 1539, the conquistadors had established a basic colonial administration, and Honduras was incorporated into the Captaincy General of Guatemala. The Spanish founded cities at Trujillo, Comayagua, Gracias, and eventually Tegucigalpa, each serving as a center for administering the surrounding indigenous communities and extracting their labor and tribute. The Spanish colonial system in Honduras was built around the encomienda system and mining. The encomienda granted Spanish colonists rights to extract labor and tribute from indigenous communities in exchange for supposed protection and Christian instruction. In practice, it was legalized slavery. Many indigenous people were sold to work in Caribbean plantations or Peruvian mines, decimating local populations. The discovery of silver in the Western Highlands during the 1530s transformed Honduras into a crucial part of the Spanish economy. Gracias became the capital of the Audiencia de los Confines in 1544, administering all of Central America. Silver mining required massive labor forces, working under deadly conditions in poorly ventilated shafts with toxic mercury. As the indigenous population declined due to disease, overwork, and violence, the Spanish began importing enslaved Africans to work in the mines and plantations. The first African slaves arrived in Honduras during the 1540s, adding another layer of cultural complexity to an already diverse colonial society. These enslaved workers brought their own traditions, technologies, and forms of resistance, contributing to the emergence of the mixed cultural landscape that characterizes modern Honduras. The Spanish colonial economy in Honduras was designed to extract wealth rather than to develop sustainable local prosperity. Silver, cattle hides, and indigenous tribute flowed eastward to Spanish ports and then across the Atlantic to Spain, while manufactured goods, wine, and luxury items flowed westward from Europe. Local production was generally limited to basic necessities, and the Spanish actively discouraged indigenous communities from maintaining their traditional economic activities. The Catholic Church established missions throughout Honduras, working to convert indigenous populations. Religious conversion was often violent, requiring abandonment of traditional practices. However, indigenous peoples often practiced syncretism, maintaining traditional beliefs while appearing to adopt Catholic practices, incorporating saints into existing spiritual frameworks. Spanish colonial society developed a rigid hierarchy based on ancestry. Peninsulares born in Spain held top positions, followed by Criollos, Spanish ancestry born in Americas, then mestizos, mixed Spanish indigenous. Indigenous peoples, despite being the majority, occupied the lowest legal status, required to pay tribute and provide labor. Enslaved Africans had no rights at all. The Spanish found the Caribbean coast of Honduras much more difficult to control than the interior highlands. The Miskito people, living in the dense forests and maze of rivers in eastern Honduras, successfully resisted Spanish conquest for decades. Their knowledge of the local environment, skill in navigating coastal waters, and eventual alliance with British pirates and traders allowed them to maintain effective independence throughout much of the colonial period. British buccaneers began using the Bay Islands as a base for attacking Spanish shipping during the late 16th century. These pirates found the Caribbean coast of Honduras ideal for their purposes. It had numerous hidden anchorages, friendly indigenous allies who had no love for the Spanish, and easy access to the Spanish trade routes that carried silver from Mexico and Peru back to Europe. The Spanish colonial authorities, focused on protecting their mining operations in the interior, never managed to establish effective control over this rebellious coastline. The pirates weren't just interested in robbing Spanish ships, they also established trading relationships with indigenous communities, providing manufactured goods, weapons, and rum in exchange for food, local products, and military alliance against Spanish forces. This created an alternative economic network that operated entirely outside Spanish colonial control and provided indigenous peoples with alternatives to submission to Spanish authority. By the early 17th century, colonial Honduras had developed its defining characteristics. Spanish-controlled interior with mining operations extracting wealth for Europe, and a largely independent Caribbean coast, controlled by indigenous peoples who traded with pirates. The indigenous population had catastrophically declined from perhaps 500,000 to fewer than 50,000 by 1600 due to disease, warfare, and exploitation. The cultural transformation was equally dramatic. Spanish became the language of administration and urban life, though indigenous languages survived rurally. Catholic Christianity became official religion, while traditional practices continued in modified forms. The collision of worlds that Columbus initiated created neither a purely Spanish nor purely indigenous society, but something entirely new, a mixed culture that would define Honduras through 3 centuries of Spanish rule and beyond. Chapter 4: Independence and the Quest for Nationhood. The dawn of the 19th century found Honduras, like most of Spanish America, caught in the turbulent currents of revolution and change that would reshape the entire continent. 300 years of Spanish colonial rule were about to end, not through gradual reform or peaceful negotiation, but through a series of dramatic events that would leave Honduras and its neighbours struggling to define what it meant to be independent nations in a world that suddenly offered both unprecedented freedom and terrifying uncertainty. The spark that ignited Central American independence came from an unexpected direction: Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808. When French armies occupied the Iberian Peninsula and placed Napoleon's brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, the entire Spanish colonial system suddenly found itself without a legitimate government to obey. Spanish colonies across the Americas faced a constitutional crisis. Should they accept the French-imposed government, remain loyal to the captive King Ferdinand VII, or declare their independence entirely? In Mexico, the independence movement erupted into immediate armed rebellion under Miguel Hidalgo and later José María Morelos. The fighting was brutal and prolonged, lasting over a decade and leaving much of New Spain in chaos. But Central America, including Honduras, initially chose a more cautious path. Colonial authorities in Guatemala City managed to maintain order and nominal loyalty to Spain, while carefully watching events unfold to the north and south. By 1821, however, the situation had become untenable. Agustín de Iturbide's successful revolution in Mexico had created an independent Mexican empire. Spain's power was clearly broken, and Central American elites realized they needed to choose their own destiny before it was chosen for them. On September 15th, 1821, representatives meeting in Guatemala City issued the Act of Independence of Central America, declaring the former Captaincy General of Guatemala, including Honduras, to be free and independent from Spanish rule. The declaration was remarkably peaceful, more like a corporate board meeting than a revolutionary uprising. There were no dramatic military campaigns, no storming of colonial fortresses, no martyred heroes dying for freedom. The Spanish colonial authorities essentially shrugged, packed their bags, and went home, leaving Central Americans to figure out what to do next. It was independence by mutual agreement rather than conquest, which was civilized but perhaps didn't provide the unifying national mythology that other Latin American countries gained through their more dramatic struggles. Almost immediately, the newly independent Central American territories faced a difficult choice. What kind of government should they establish? The Mexican Empire under Iturbide looked attractive to some conservative leaders who preferred monarchical institutions and close ties to a larger, more powerful neighbor. Liberal leaders, influenced by the example of the United States, favored a federal republic that would give individual provinces significant autonomy while maintaining regional unity. In Honduras, this debate revealed the fundamental political division that would dominate the country's politics for the next century. The city of Comayagua, traditional center of colonial administration, supported joining the Mexican Empire. Tegucigalpa, the growing mining center, favored independence and federation with other Central American provinces. It was an early indication that Honduras would struggle not just with questions of national governance, but with regional rivalries and competing visions of the country's future. The Mexican option lasted barely 2 years. When Iturbide was overthrown in 1823, Central America found itself once again independent and needing to create new governmental institutions. On July 1st, 1823, the 5 Central American provinces, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, came together to form the Federal Republic of Central America, adopting a constitution modeled closely on that of the United States. The Central American Federation represented an ambitious attempt to create a unified regional power that could compete economically and politically with larger neighbors like Mexico and Gran Colombia. The federal constitution provided for a central government responsible for foreign relations, defense, and interstate commerce, while individual states maintained control over local affairs. It was an elegant theoretical solution to the problem of balancing unity with local autonomy, but it proved extraordinarily difficult to implement in practice. From the beginning, the Federation was plagued by the same fundamental political divisions that had emerged during the independence debates. Liberals, concentrated in cities and commercial areas, favoured reducing the power of the Catholic Church, encouraging foreign investment, promoting free trade, and modernising legal and educational systems along European and North American models. Conservatives, stronger in rural areas and traditional centres of authority, wanted to preserve the social hierarchies, religious institutions, and economic structures that had provided stability during the colonial period. These weren't just abstract political philosophies, they represented genuine conflicts over how Central American society should be organized. Liberals wanted to end church control over education, legalize civil marriage and divorce, abolish religious courts, and open church lands to private ownership. Conservatives viewed these proposals as attacks on the very foundations of social order, family life, and moral authority. The result was a political struggle that often escalated into armed conflict. Honduras found itself at the center of these conflicts when a young Tegucigalpa lawyer named Francisco Morazán emerged as the most effective military and political leader of the liberal cause. Morazán was born in 1792 into a middle-class family of Corsican and Spanish ancestry. He was largely self-educated, having taught himself law, history, and political theory from whatever books he could obtain in provincial Honduras. His early career was typical of ambitious young men in the early Republican period. He served in local government, practiced law, and gradually built a network of political contacts. But Morazán's life changed dramatically when the first president of the Central American Federation, Manuel José Arce, abandoned his liberal allies and formed a coalition with conservative forces. Arce's betrayal sparked a civil war that would rage from 1827 to 1829, with Honduras serving as both a major battleground and the source of the liberal movement's most effective leadership. When conservative forces occupied Comayagua and captured the liberal governor of Honduras, Dionisio de Herrera, in 1827, Morazán fled to Nicaragua to organize resistance. He returned with a small army of Honduran exiles and Nicaraguan allies, determined to liberate his homeland and restore liberal government to the Federation. At the Battle of La Trinidad on November 11th, 1827, Morazán's forces defeated a much larger conservative army, establishing his reputation as a brilliant military strategist and the undisputed leader of the liberal cause. Over the next 2 years, Morazán's army fought its way across Central America, winning victories in Honduras, El Salvador, and finally Guatemala, where they captured Guatemala City in April 1829. It was a remarkable military campaign that demonstrated both Morazán's tactical genius and the deep popular support for liberal reforms among urban populations and rural communities that had been marginalized by conservative governments. In 1830, Morazán was elected president of the Central American Federation, a position he would hold for most of the next decade. His presidency represented the high water mark of liberal reform in Central America, as he implemented an ambitious program designed to modernize the region's economy, society, and government. He established freedom of religion, speech, and the press, legalized civil marriage, abolished religious courts, confiscated church properties, and promoted foreign investment and free trade. Morazán also moved the federal capital from Guatemala City to San Salvador, both to reduce Guatemalan dominance over the federation and to place the government in a more liberal-friendly environment. He reformed legal codes, promoted public education, and attempted to create the infrastructure necessary for economic development. His reforms were far-reaching, and in many ways, ahead of their time. They anticipated changes that wouldn't be successfully implemented in most of Central America until the late 19th or early 20th centuries. But Morazán's reforms also generated intense opposition from conservative forces who viewed them as attacks on traditional values. The abolition of religious courts angered people who relied on church mediation. The confiscation of church properties created economic disruption. The legalization of civil marriage offended Catholics who viewed marriage as a religious sacrament. More seriously, Morazán's government lacked administrative capacity and financial resources to implement reforms effectively. The Federation had no tax collection system, and states were reluctant to surrender revenues. The result was chronic financial crisis that forced the government to resort to forced loans and heavy-handed measures that undermined support even among liberals. The Federation's problems were compounded by regional rivalries and personal conflicts among its political leaders. Guatemala resented losing its dominant position to smaller neighbors. Wealthy merchants in various cities competed for favorable trade policies. Military commanders developed personal loyalties that often trumped political principles. What had been conceived as a unified nation increasingly functioned as an unstable alliance of competing local interests. By the late 1830s, conservative opposition had coalesced around charismatic leaders like Rafael Carrera in Guatemala, who combined religious traditionalism with appeals to indigenous and rural populations that felt threatened by liberal modernization. Carrera's movement represented a genuinely popular conservative alternative to liberal reforms, drawing support from people who valued stability and tradition over rapid change and foreign influences. The final crisis came in 1837 when a devastating cholera epidemic swept through Central America, killing thousands of people and creating social chaos that both sides blamed on their political opponents. Conservatives argued that the epidemic was God's punishment for liberal attacks on the church. Liberals claimed that conservative opposition to public health measures had made the crisis worse. The epidemic became a political issue that further polarized an already divided region. In 1838, first Nicaragua, then Honduras, then Costa Rica, declared their withdrawal from the Federation. The federal government, despite Morazán's efforts to hold it together, simply lacked the military and financial resources to prevent the secession of its member states. On November 5, 1838, Honduras declared its absolute independence, not just from Spain or Mexico, but from any larger political entity that might limit its sovereignty. Francisco Morazán made one last attempt to restore the Federation, returning from exile in 1842 to launch a military campaign from Costa Rica. But Central Americans had grown tired of war and political upheaval. His invasion was quickly defeated, and he was captured and executed in San Jose on September 15, 1842, ironically, on the anniversary of Central American independence. His death marked the definitive end of the federal experiment and the beginning of Honduras's existence as a fully independent nation. The collapse of the Central American Federation left Honduras facing the enormous challenge of creating stable governmental institutions and a functioning economy as an independent nation. The country that emerged in 1838 was small, poor, geographically fragmented, and deeply divided between liberal and conservative factions. It had a population of perhaps 300,000 people scattered across difficult terrain, minimal infrastructure, almost no industrial development, and a government with virtually no experience in managing national affairs. The first constitutional president of independent Honduras was Francisco Ferrera, a conservative who took office in 1841. Ferrera's administration established basic governmental institutions but also set patterns of instability that would plague the country for decades. Like most early presidents, he faced constant rebellions from political opponents and regional caudillos. Independence hadn't resolved underlying conflicts that destroyed the federation. Liberals and conservatives still disagreed about church roles, government power, foreign investment, and social change. The result was political chaos that characterized Honduras for the rest of the 19th century. Between 1838 and 1900, the country experienced nearly 300 internal rebellions, civil wars, and changes of government. These weren't just minor political squabbles, they were serious armed conflicts that disrupted economic development, discouraged foreign investment, and prevented the emergence of effective national institutions. The presidency became a prize to be won through military victory rather than electoral competition, and political opposition often meant armed rebellion rather than parliamentary debate. It was a pattern that would make Honduras one of the most politically unstable countries in Latin America throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Despite these challenges, Honduras made some progress toward creating national identity during the post-independence period. The country participated in several attempts to restore Central American unity, recognizing that its small size made regional cooperation attractive. But these efforts all failed due to the same regional rivalries and ideological conflicts that had destroyed the original federation. As we move toward the later 19th century, it's clear that Honduras's struggle for nationhood was far from over. The dream of Francisco Morazán, a unified, modern, prosperous Central America governed by liberal democratic institutions, had died with him. But the problems he tried to solve remained pressing. The Honduras that emerged from this nation-building period would soon face new challenges from foreign corporations and the emergence of the Banana Republic. Chapter 5: The Banana Republic and Modern Upheavals. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Honduras found itself in a position that would have been familiar to many of its Latin American neighbours. Politically unstable, economically underdeveloped, and increasingly attractive to foreign investors who saw opportunity where locals saw only problems. The chronic governmental chaos that had defined Honduras since independence was about to encounter a new force that would transform the country in ways that its founders could never have imagined. That force was the humble banana, and the not-so-humble American corporations that would turn this tropical fruit into the foundation of an economic empire. The story of how Honduras became the world's original banana republic begins in the late 1800s with a combination of Honduran desperation and American entrepreneurialism that would prove irresistible to both sides, at least initially. Honduras needed infrastructure, roads, railroads, ports, but lacked the capital to build them. American businessmen needed tropical agricultural land and transportation networks, but lacked local political connections. It seemed like a match made in heaven, though as events would prove, it was more like a deal made with significantly less benevolent forces. The banana trade had started almost by accident in the 1870s when New England sea captain Lorenzo Dow Baker bought some bananas in Jamaica and discovered that Americans had an apparently unlimited appetite for this exotic yellow fruit. What had been a local Caribbean curiosity soon became a booming international business, and enterprising Americans began looking for new sources of supply. Honduras, with its Caribbean coastline, tropical climate, and need for investment, seemed like the perfect location for banana plantations. In 1899, the Boston Fruit Company merged with Minor Keith's Banana Enterprises to create the United Fruit Company. a corporate giant that would dominate Central America. United Fruit brought unprecedented capital and technology, but also a business model that treated entire countries as corporate subsidiaries. The company's expansion into Honduras began when United Fruit negotiated concessions with the cash-strapped government. In exchange for building railroads, the company received massive land grants, often 2,500 acres per kilometer of track. But United Fruit built railroads that served their plantations rather than connecting Honduran cities, creating infrastructure designed to extract wealth rather than promote development. United Fruit wasn't the only player in this game. The Vaccaro brothers, Italian immigrants who had started their careers selling overripe bananas in New Orleans, established their own Honduran operations and eventually created the Standard Fruit Company, which would later become Dole. Samuel Zimuri, a Moldovan Jewish immigrant who started as a small-scale banana dealer, founded the QML Fruit Company and proved even more willing than his competitors to use questionable methods to protect his investments. Among Hondurans, United Fruit became known as El Pulpo, the octopus, because its tentacles seemed to reach into every aspect of national life. The company didn't just grow bananas, it controlled the railroads that transported them, the ships that carried them to foreign markets, the ports where they were loaded, the telegraph systems that coordinated operations, and increasingly, the politicians who made the laws that governed them. By the 1920s, it was difficult to determine where United Fruit Company ended and the Honduran government began. The transformation of Honduras into a banana republic became complete during the presidency of Manuel Bonilla, who served from 1912 to 1913. Bonilla owed his position to one of the most brazen examples of corporate interference in Latin American politics. He had been installed in a coup financed and organized by Sam Zimuri's Cuyamel Fruit Company, when the previous president, Miguel Davila, had shown insufficient enthusiasm for Zimuri's business interests. The American businessman hired a mercenary army led by Lee Christmas, a former railroad conductor turned soldier of fortune, to overthrow the government. The coup was remarkably successful, and Bonilla proved gratifyingly cooperative with his corporate sponsors. Christmas was rewarded with command of the Honduran army, and later appointment as United States consul to Honduras, a position that gave him diplomatic immunity while he continued his various entrepreneurial activities. Zimuri received the favorable concessions he had sought, and American fruit companies gained virtual control over large sections of Honduran territory. By the 1920s, American fruit companies controlled nearly 3 million acres of Honduran land, much of it the most fertile coastal territory in the country. The United States Embassy report noted that the territory controlled by Cuyamel Fruit Company was a state itself, within another state, complete with its own housing, railroads, power plants, commissaries, and recreational facilities for American employees. Honduran workers lived in company housing, shopped in company stores, and found their lives regulated by company rules that often had more practical authority than Honduran law. The economic impact of the banana industry was undeniable. By the 1920s, bananas represented more than 60% of Honduras's export earnings, and the industry employed tens of thousands of Honduran workers. The fruit companies brought modern technology, medical facilities, and infrastructure to previously undeveloped regions. They also created the first large-scale wage economy in Honduran history, paying cash salaries to workers who had previously survived through subsistence agriculture or barter systems. But the benefits came with significant costs. The banana companies' land grants often displaced existing communities, forcing small farmers to become plantation workers or migrate to less fertile areas. The focus on banana production for export meant that Honduras became increasingly dependent on a single crop for its economic survival, making the country vulnerable to fluctuations in international markets and corporate decision-making beyond its control. The political influence of the fruit companies reached its peak during the dictatorship of Tiburcio Carías Andino, who ruled Honduras from 1932 to 1949. Carías maintained close relationships with both United Fruit and the United States government, using their support to suppress political opposition and maintain the stability that foreign investors desired. His rule coincided with the Great Depression and World War II, periods when international markets were disrupted and political stability became even more valuable to American businesses. The comfortable relationship between foreign corporations and authoritarian government began to change in the 1950s, when Honduran workers organized what would become the largest labor strike in the country's history. In May 1954, 25,000 banana workers, nearly 15% of Honduras's entire labor force, walked off their jobs, demanding better wages, improved working conditions, and recognition of their right to organize unions. The strike began when dock workers in Puerto Cortes demanded the double holiday pay required by Honduran law, but denied by their employers. When United Fruit Company managers refused to negotiate as long as workers remained on strike, the protests spread to other banana operations and then to workers in tobacco, textiles, mining, and other industries. Students, teachers, and urban professionals joined in solidarity strikes that effectively shut down much of the Honduran economy. For the first time in Honduran history, workers successfully forced a major foreign corporation to negotiate. Standard Fruit agreed to increase wages and improve conditions, while United Fruit eventually made similar concessions. The strike marked the beginning of organized labor as a significant political force in Honduras, and demonstrated that the banana companies were not as all-powerful as they had appeared. The success of the banana workers' strike coincided with broader changes that would challenge the fruit companies' dominance throughout Central America. In Guatemala, the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz attempted to expropriate unused United Fruit lands as part of an agrarian reform program. The company's response was to lobby the United States government for military intervention, resulting in a CIA-sponsored coup that overthrew Arbenz in 1954 and restored a government friendly to American business interests. By the 1960s, however, the era of direct corporate control over Central American politics was beginning to end. The costs and risks of maintaining extensive land holdings in politically volatile regions were becoming apparent, and the companies gradually shifted their business model from owning plantations to contracting with local growers. United Fruit sold most of its Honduran properties and focused on marketing and distribution rather than production. The end of the classic Banana Republic era didn't mean the end of Honduras's problems with political instability and foreign intervention. The country became caught up in the Cold War struggles that racked Central America during the 1980s, serving as a base for United States-backed Contra rebels fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. American military aid and the presence of thousands of Contra fighters turned Honduras into what critics called an aircraft carrier for United States operations throughout the region. But perhaps the most bizarre and tragic example of Honduras's continued vulnerability to political violence came in 1969, when the country found itself fighting what became known as the Soccer War with neighboring El Salvador. The conflict nominally began over tensions surrounding World Cup qualifying matches between the two countries, but the real causes ran much deeper and reflected the same kinds of demographic and economic pressures that had shaped Honduran history for decades. El Salvador, with 5 times Honduras's population density, had experienced decades of emigration to its larger neighbor. By 1969, 300,000 Salvadorans lived in Honduras, over 10% of the population. When Honduras implemented land reform redistributing properties to citizens, thousands of Salvadoran families were evicted from land they'd worked for generations. Soccer matches between the countries became vehicles for expressing these tensions. The first game in Tegucigalpa saw Honduran fans keeping visitors awake with firecrackers. Honduras won and riots followed. El Salvador won the second game 3-0 amid crowd violence. The decisive match in Mexico City saw El Salvador qualify for the World Cup, but diplomatic relations had already collapsed. On July 14, 1969, Salvador launched surprise attacks on Honduran airfields while ground forces invaded. The war lasted exactly 100 hours before OAS negotiated ceasefire, resulting in thousands of deaths and over 100,000 displaced Salvadorans. For Honduras, the soccer war demonstrated both the country's continued vulnerability to external pressures and its government's inability to manage complex social and economic problems. The massive deportation of Salvadoran workers created labor shortages in agriculture, while the breakdown of regional trade hurt the economy. Military spending increased dramatically, further straining budgets and reinforcing the political influence of armed forces. The war's aftermath coincided with broader changes in Honduran politics. The traditional liberal-conservative system began fragmenting as new groups challenged established dominance. Military officers, influenced by reformist movements elsewhere in Latin America, began seeing themselves as agents of modernization rather than simply guardians of the status quo. In 1972, General López Arellano led a coup establishing military government and promising reforms to address poverty and inequality. His government initiated ambitious programs of land redistribution, infrastructure development, and social services expansion that represented the most significant systematic reform attempt since 19th century liberal governments. But like previous reform efforts, the programs faced insurmountable obstacles. Oil crises reduced revenues, resistance from economic interests limited land reform, and corruption scandals undermined public confidence. The return to civilian government in 1982 marked the longest constitutional period in Honduran history. Though democracy remained fragile, the country continued facing the same fundamental challenges that had shaped its development since independence. Weak governmental institutions, economic dependence on primary exports, profound social inequalities, and vulnerability to external pressures. As we approach the end of our historical journey, it's clear that patterns established during the colonial period and reinforced during the Banana Republic era continue influencing Honduras today. The country remains one of Latin America's poorest, with high levels of violence, corruption, and emigration. The dreams of 19th century liberals like Francisco Morazán of a unified, prosperous, democratic Central America remain largely unfulfilled. Yet Honduras's story is also one of remarkable resilience and cultural vitality. Despite centuries of political upheaval and economic exploitation, Hondurans have maintained strong cultural traditions and national identity that survived foreign domination, civil wars, natural disasters, and economic crises, a testament to the enduring spirit of people who have learned to adapt and survive against considerable odds. Chapter 6: Contemporary Honduras: Resilience Amid Struggle. As Honduras entered the final decades of the 20th century and crossed the threshold into the new millennium, the country found itself grappling with challenges that seemed both frustratingly familiar and uniquely contemporary. The return to civilian government in 1982 had raised hopes for democratic consolidation, economic development, and social progress, but the reality proved far more complicated than the promises. Like an ancient tree that has survived countless storms, Honduras would face tests that threatened to uproot everything its people had built, yet somehow managed to endure with a resilience that speaks to something deeper than political institutions or economic systems. The story of contemporary Honduras is perhaps best told through moments of crisis that revealed both the country's vulnerabilities and its extraordinary capacity for survival. The first of these defining moments came not from human conflict but from nature itself, in the form of Hurricane Mitch, a storm that would become synonymous with devastation on an almost biblical scale. In late October 1998, what had started as a tropical depression in the Caribbean rapidly intensified into a Category 5 hurricane, one of the most powerful storms ever recorded in the Atlantic. Mitch initially threatened to strike Honduras with winds exceeding 180 miles per hour, but in a cruel twist of meteorological fate, the hurricane slowed to a crawl as it approached the coast, hovering over Central America like a malevolent presence that refused to move on. For 5 days, the storm dumped what amounted to a year's worth of rainfall onto Honduras in less than a week. Some areas received 75 inches of rain, transforming rivers into raging torrents and mountainsides into muddy avalanches that swept away entire communities. The destruction was almost incomprehensible in scale. More than 7,000 Hondurans died, with thousands more missing and presumed dead. Nearly 2 million people, 1/3 of the entire population, were directly affected by the storm. 1 million Hondurans lost their homes, and 70% of the country's productive infrastructure was damaged or destroyed. Roads, bridges, airports, and communication networks simply vanished under the floodwaters and landslides. The banana plantations that had defined Honduras's economy for nearly a century were obliterated, leaving tens of thousands of agricultural workers with no jobs and no income. President Carlos Roberto Flores captured the magnitude of the catastrophe when he declared that Hurricane Mitch had destroyed 50 years of economic progress in a matter of days. The government's initial estimate for reconstruction costs was $5 billion, more than 4 times the country's entire national budget. For a nation that had always struggled with poverty and underdevelopment, the hurricane represented not just a natural disaster, but an existential crisis that threatened to push Honduras backward into a level of destitution not seen since colonial times. Yet, even in the midst of such overwhelming destruction, Hurricane Mitch revealed something remarkable about the Honduran character. International observers were amazed by the speed with which communities organized themselves to help their neighbors, share scarce resources, and begin the enormous task of rebuilding. Churches, schools, and community centers became coordination points for relief efforts. Families took in strangers who had lost everything. Young people organized brigades to clear debris from roads and help search for survivors. The international response was impressive, with countries pledging nearly $7 billion in reconstruction assistance. The effort was conceived as transformation rather than simple restoration. Donors insisted aid be used for stronger infrastructure and sustainable practices. But like many development programs, reconstruction faced familiar obstacles. Corruption diverted funds, political infighting delayed projects, and aid conditions sometimes proved counterproductive. Perhaps most significantly, Hurricane Mitch accelerated patterns of migration that had been building for decades. Hundreds of thousands of Hondurans whose livelihoods had been destroyed by the storm saw no alternative but to leave their homeland in search of work elsewhere. The United States became the primary destination for these economic refugees, creating Honduran communities in cities like Los Angeles, New York, Miami, and Houston. By the early 2000s, remittances sent home by Honduran workers abroad had become one of the country's largest sources of foreign currency, a lifeline for millions of families, but also a sign of how many Hondurans felt compelled to seek their futures outside their own country. The wounds left by Hurricane Mitch were still healing when Honduras was struck by another crisis that would prove equally devastating, though this time the damage was political rather than meteorological. On June 28, 2009, ironically, Just one day before the 31st anniversary of the Soccer War, democratically elected President Manuel Zelaya was awakened before dawn by soldiers who forced him from his residence, put him on a military aircraft, and flew him into exile in Costa Rica. The coup that removed Zelaya from power was rooted in a political conflict that had been brewing for months over his proposal to hold a referendum on whether Honduras should convene a constitutional assembly to consider reforms to the FAN, national constitution. Zelaya argued that the country's constitution, written during the transition to civilian government in the 1980s, was outdated and needed to be modernized to address contemporary challenges like poverty, corruption, and social inequality. But Zelaya's opponents, including the Supreme Court, the National Congress, the military leadership, and much of the traditional political and business elite, saw his proposed referendum as a thinly disguised attempt to eliminate presidential term limits and allow himself to seek re-election, something explicitly forbidden by the Honduran constitution. They argued that Zelaya was following the example of Venezuela's Hugo Chavez and other leftist Latin American leaders who had used constitutional reforms to consolidate power and undermine democratic institutions. The legal and political conflict surrounding Zelaya's referendum proposal became increasingly heated during the spring of 2009. The Supreme Court ruled the referendum illegal, but Zelaya insisted on proceeding anyway. When the military refused to distribute ballot materials for the vote, Zelaya fired the armed forces commander. The Supreme Court ordered the general's reinstatement. Zelaya ignored the court order. The Attorney General filed criminal charges against the president for violating the Constitution. It was a classic constitutional crisis of the type that had plagued Honduras throughout its history, a situation where different branches of government claimed conflicting authorities, and there was no clear legal mechanism for resolving the dispute. The Honduran constitution provided no procedures for removing a sitting president through legal means. Even if that president was accused of violating the law, the result was a political stalemate that could only be resolved through either compromise or force. Compromise proved impossible, and force won the day when soldiers acting on orders from the Supreme Court arrested President Zelaya and spirited him out of the country rather than bringing him before a judge for trial. The National Congress quickly accepted what it claimed was Zelaya's resignation letter, though Zelaya insisted he had never written such a document, and installed Roberto Micheletti, the congressional president, as interim president. The international reaction to Zelaya's removal was swift and overwhelmingly negative. Every government in Latin America condemned the coup, as did the United States, Canada, and the European Union. The Organization of American States suspended Honduras's membership, and regional organizations imposed economic sanctions. International observers pointed out that even if Zelaya had violated the Constitution, removing him through military force rather than legal procedures was itself a violation of constitutional order and democratic governance. Within Honduras, the coup divided the country more deeply than any political event since the Soccer War. Supporters of Zelaya's removal argued that they had saved democracy from a would-be dictator who was attempting to follow the Venezuelan model of authoritarian populism. They organized large demonstrations calling for Micheletti to be recognized as the legitimate president and demanding that the international community respect Honduras's sovereignty. But opponents of the coup, organized into a movement called the National Front of Popular Resistance, insisted that Zelaya's removal was an illegal act by traditional elites who refused to accept the results of democratic elections. They organized daily protests demanding Zelaya's restoration to power, and these demonstrations were often met with violent repression by police and military forces. According to human rights organizations, over 3,000 people were illegally detained in the months following the coup, and at least 41 people associated with the resistance movement were killed. The crisis dragged on for 7 months, during which Honduras became increasingly isolated from the international community. The interim government suspended constitutional rights, shut down media outlets that supported Zelaya, and imposed curfews to prevent demonstrations. Economic activity slowed as businesses struggled with the uncertainty created by political instability and international sanctions. Tourism virtually disappeared, and foreign investment dried up. The crisis officially ended in January 2010 with the inauguration of Porfirio Lobo, a conservative politician who had won presidential elections held in November 2009. But many countries refused to recognize the legitimacy of elections held under military rule, and Lobo's government spent much of its time trying to restore Honduras's international standing. More importantly, the coup had deepened social and political divisions within Honduras that would continue to affect the country for years to come. The aftermath of the coup coincided with dramatic violence increases that made Honduras one of the world's most dangerous countries. By 2012, Honduras had the planet's highest murder rate, over 90 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. Much violence was drug-related, as Mexican cartels used Honduras as a transit route for cocaine. Weak institutions and corruption created ideal conditions for organized crime, leading to territorial wars, gang violence, and systematic murders that devastated society and accelerated migration patterns. Yet even during these darkest periods, Honduras continued to demonstrate the cultural resilience and creativity that had allowed it to survive centuries of political upheaval and economic exploitation. Honduran musicians, artists, writers, and filmmakers produced works of extraordinary beauty and power that captured both the pain of their country's struggles and the enduring strength of its people. The country's rich indigenous heritage found new expressions through contemporary art and literature that celebrated Maya, Lenca, and other pre-Columbian traditions while addressing modern challenges. Perhaps most significantly, the political crisis of 2009 had an unexpected consequence in the rise of a new generation of Honduran leaders who were committed to democratic governance and social justice. The resistance movement that opposed the coup became a training ground for community organizers, human rights activists, and political leaders who brought fresh perspectives to old problems. Many of these leaders were women, indigenous people, and young people who had been excluded from traditional political institutions, but who brought energy and ideas that began to change the conversation about Honduras's future. This new political energy culminated in the 2021 election of Xiomara Castro, Manuel Zelaya's wife, as Honduras's first female president. Castro's victory was remarkable not just because she broke gender barriers, but because it represented a peaceful return to power for the political movement that had been ousted in the 2009 coup. Her election suggested that despite all the violence and instability of the previous decade, Honduran democratic institutions had survived and might even be strengthened by the struggles they had endured. As we conclude our historical journey, contemporary Honduras faces serious challenges: poverty, violence, corruption, emigration, yet the story we've traced reveals extraordinary resilience. This people have survived Spanish conquest, civil wars, banana company domination, natural disasters, military coups, and drug violence, while maintaining cultural identity and fundamental humanity. The Geographic Foundation explored at our journey's beginning mountains covering 3/4 of the country, dual coastlines connecting to 2 oceans, the unique position as Central America's only volcano-free nation, continues shaping possibilities and challenges. The human geography built through centuries of indigenous innovation, Spanish colonization, African contributions, and contemporary migration remains both strength and complexity. Perhaps the most important lesson from this historical journey is that Honduras, like the mountains defining its landscape, has proven remarkably durable. The country has endured challenges that might have destroyed less resilient societies while maintaining cultural traditions, family bonds, and national identity that make Honduras more than lines on a map or development statistics. The story of Honduras is ultimately about human communities' capacity to adapt, survive, and flourish despite enormous challenges. It reminds us that history encompasses not just governments and economics, but ordinary people making extraordinary efforts to build better lives. That story continues today as millions of Hondurans, whether in their homeland or scattered globally, work to create a future worthy of their remarkable past and enduring dreams.